Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book, where we peel back the layers of complex ideas. In Season 08, Episode 05, we confront a concept that has shaped civilizations and fueled countless debates. Empire, as explored in Chapter 5 of Andrew J. Williams, Amelia Hadfield, and J. Simon Rofe's International History and International Relations. Our mission here, as always, is to take these dense, complex sources, pull out the really vital insights, and help you get informed fast. Today, we're tackling empire. It's a word you hear all the time, right? Sometimes thrown around as an insult, sometimes maybe with a bit of nostalgia.
Yeah, it gets used pretty loosely.
Exactly. So we need some precision. For this deep dive, we're asking, what is an empire, really? How has international relations, IR, scholarship looked at it? Which historical examples actually help us understand it best? And maybe, what lessons can we take away for today?
Okay, let's unpack this. The source kicks off with some really powerful lines. Virgil talking about dominion without end.
Yeah, evocative stuff. And then Keats, imagining the Spanish Empire, just as Britain's own empire was really taking shape. There's this immediate tension, isn't there? Empires promise forever, dominion without end, but the source points out they all come and go.
Every single one, eventually.
Right. And then you have quotes like Skidelsky suggesting empires, maybe at their best, stood for things like multiracialism, religious tolerance, even devolution. It's complicated. So what are the core characteristics? What actually makes something an empire? And why is it so hard to define?
Well, that's the crux of it, isn't it? Empire is hugely significant historically, but today, well, it's often just a label, a term of disapproval, like you said, imperialist, fascist, or, weirdly, this nostalgic thing for order.
Yeah, sort of selective memory.
Exactly. So to cut through that, our text gives us two key definitions to work with. First, there's Dominic Levin, who basically says an empire is a very great power that has left its mark on international relations of an era. Pretty broad.
Okay, so impact is key there.
Right. Then Michael Doyle offers something more specific. Empires are relationships of political control imposed by some political societies over the effective sovereignty of other political societies. Control over sovereignty.
That sounds more like what we often think of.
It does, but there's a warning here from Anthony Pagden. Define it too widely, and the concept kind of dissolves, becomes useless. That's why the source is careful, focusing on examples like the Mongols or the US, but maybe setting aside others like, say, historical China, depending on which definition you use. It helps keep the analysis sharp.
Right, keeps it focused.
And it's interesting how the academic field itself changed. Studying empires used to be seen as a bit, well, fusty, old-fashioned. But after 1990, boom, a huge resurgence in interest.
Why then? After the Cold War ended.
Precisely. It contrasts sharply with the feeling after World War II when empires looked really vulnerable. Before 1939, many thought they were permanent fixtures. It really took the fall of the Soviet Union to make scholars think, hang on, maybe empire isn't just history, maybe it's still relevant now.
Okay, so that brings us to power. How do empires actually work? The source talks about Roman types, military, legal control, and Greek types. More about ideas, culture. What does that mean for how they operate day to day?
Well, it's rarely just one thing. It's not just armies marching in.
Right. The source mentions the U.S. in the 50s, using Hollywood and martial aid to woo Europe.
Soft power.
While also making sure they didn't, go communist. It's that mix, that force and persuasion the text talks about.
Exactly. And zooming out, the source makes the point that in any imperial relationship, force and persuasion are basically potential tools, often used together. It's not an either.
Okay.
And this is where Michael Hart and Antonio Negri come in with some really influential, though controversial, ideas.
Wow.
They basically argued that empire and world order are now almost the same thing.
Synonymous.
How so?
Cemented by economic globalization, spread by Euro-American ideas and practices, not just coercion.
Yeah.
They also argued there wasn't some clean passing of the torch from Europe to the U.S.
Like a handover. Yeah, more like a symbiotic thing. And controversially, they claimed no single nation state can be the center of this modern empire. Instead, it's this global system being challenged by what they called the creative forces of the multitude.
Interesting. Challenged from below, sort of.
Kind of. It ties into deeper ideas about power. Stephen Lukes, for example, talks about power in multiple dimensions. There's the obvious kind. A forces B to do something.
Okay, straightforward coercion.
But then there's power as a subtler mix. Coercion, influence, authority, force, manipulation. And maybe the deepest level is the power to keep certain issues off the table altogether, to shape what people even consider possible or in their interest.
Wow, so controlling the agenda, basically, preventing dissent before it even starts.
Precisely. It suppresses the real interests, as Luke's puts it. And that connects to Foucault's idea of biopower control through everyday things, these micro practices that shape our lives, our health, even our thoughts. An empire of the mind.
Which makes it hard to even know if you're truly consenting, right?
Exactly. Which brings us back to Gramsci's point. Ultimately, stable power relies on consent, even if that consent is manufactured or heavily influenced.
And this manufacturing of consent often involves creating an other, doesn't it?
Right.
Defining who's in and who's out.
Absolutely crucial. Empires often define themselves against another. Think barbarians versus civilized or the inferior natives. This happens through dominant stories, cultural ideas, what Marx might call the superstructure.
Like Edward Said's Orientalism.
A perfect example. Said showed how Western literature and scholarship created this image of the Orient as fundamentally different, exotic, often inferior. And you can see how those kinds of tropes, sadly, played into real-world politics and military actions, especially post 9/11 with the War on Terror.
So culture isn't just fluff, it's central to how power works.
Definitely. It puts culture right back at the heart of understanding international relations and empire.
Okay, let's pivot from the theory to the history. The source walks us through some key examples. Where better to start than Athens? It's one of the oldest discussions of empire in IR, right?
It really is. Athens starts as this alliance, the Delian League, against Persia, but then it morphs into what's called a thalassocracy, an empire based on sea power.
Naval power, controlling the Aegean.
Exactly. And the famous, or infamous, Melian dialogue from Thucydides. Well, it's a chillingly stark illustration of Athenian power politics. Force is what matters.
Might makes right, essentially.
Pretty much. Winkler sums it up. Hegemonious supremacy became arch-domination, and as Doyle points out, you need that structure. Empire requires both a metropole and a periphery, a center and its controlled territories.
But Athens, despite its fall, left a huge legacy.
Immense. Democracy, philosophy, drama, the Olympics. Its cultural influence lasted long after Rome took over politically. It sort of nurtured Rome, in a way, through the Hellenistic world Alexander the Great created.
Which brings us to Rome. If Athens laid groundwork, the source calls Rome the archetype, doesn't it?
It really does. The sheer longevity is incredible. 700 BCE all the way to 1453 CE if you count Byzantium, the Eastern Empire.
Wow. Over 2 millennia in some form.
And think of the institutions, the military, the law, the languages, the architecture. Its legacy is everywhere. It inspired imitators, some successful, arguably the U.S. borrows a lot.
Right, the eagle, the architecture.
And some less successful, like Mussolini's Italy trying to revive Roman glory. Gibbon famously described Rome at its height as covering the fairest part of the earth and the most civilized portion of mankind. He argued its peace came from constant readiness for war mixed with moderation.
But there was also that idea of bringing civilization against barbarians.
Yes, Mommsen highlighted that self-perception. It could be seen as liberating in some ways, but it absolutely justified brutal conquest and repression too.
And there's a link to globalization.
A strong one. Harold James talks about the Roman dilemma. Basically, any rule-based world order eventually creates internal conflicts, sometimes needing imperial action to stabilize things. It's this cycle. Order, breakdown, intervention, order. You saw it with Rome, with Britain, and arguably you see it with America today.
That cycle sounds familiar.
And the analogy goes further. Just like Roman citizens eventually came from all over the empire, not just Italy, you see American power now working through multinational corporations staffed by people from everywhere.
So empires rise, they exert power, but the narrative always seems to turn toward decline. Why is that? Before we get into the why, what about other examples? Byzantium, the Mongols.
Good point. Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, often gets a bad rap. You know, the word Byzantine meaning overly complex bureaucracy.
Yeah, it sounds like a criticism.
But for others, particularly in Russia, it was seen as a peak of Western civilization. It lasted for over 1,000 years after Rome itself fell, preserved so much Greek and Roman knowledge, and acted as a buffer protecting Christian Europe. Ironically, its biggest blow came from fellow Christians, the Crusaders, sacking Constantinople in 1204.
Ouch. And the Mongols. They have a fearsome reputation.
They do, often seen as just destructive, genocidal even. But the source points out a huge positive. They connected Europe and the Far East, commercially and culturally, for the first time in a major way, a kind of early globalization.
Okay, linking the world.
And they united China after centuries of division, which Levin notes has basically held ever since. So yes, terrifying military power, but also a significant, if unintended, civilizing influence in terms of trade and political unity.
Fascinating. Okay, let's bring it closer to home. The source argues European empires, the ones growing out of modern nation-states, are the ones that shape our world most directly today. And the British Empire looms large there.
Absolutely. Britain explicitly saw itself as a new Rome, even though its own start under Rome wasn't exactly glorious, according to Gibbon. They had this Britannic vision, independence and unity combined.
A model for unions, maybe?
Perhaps. Interestingly, the push for empire intensified in the late 19th century, partly out of a fear of British decline. It was seen as a way to protect the core nation and maintain global order. That famous splendid isolation. Less a policy, more a problem they were trying to solve. Eventually, Pax Britannica gave way to Pax Americana after 1945.
And the legacy is debated, right? Accidental good versus intentional harm.
Hugely debated. One school sees it as almost accidental, bringing peace, trade, infrastructure, the Pax idea. The other sees deliberate exploitation and damaging consequences. The Opium Wars, the Indian Mutiny, drawing lines on maps in the Middle East that cause conflict today.
Two very different stories.
And the ending is debated too. Was it freedoms at midnight? A noble granting of independence and democracy? Or do we focus on the nasty counterinsurgency campaigns, like in Kenya described as nasty, brutish, and in shorts, or even Britain's gulag?
Harsh words.
They are. The legacy is mixed. A smaller commonwealth, yes, but also local democratic traditions in many places. Yet critics point out that even international bodies like the UN might have colonial origins and flaws stemming from that.
Okay, what about the Russian and Soviet case? Was the USSR an empire?
Well, the Tsarist Empire definitely emerged through brutal human agency, as the source puts it. Then the Soviet Union, despite its anti-imperial ideology.
Yeah.
Well, it certainly fit the definition. A clear center dominating a periphery linking power and nationalism.
So, ideology aside, it functioned like one.
Many argue yes. George Kennan's analysis during the Cold War basically saw Russia as having a consistent imperial identity since Ivan the Terrible. And Ivan set a brutal standard, arguably continued by Soviet leaders with the Gulag and purges. They exerted tight ideological control, too, not just militarily the communist solar system.
But its end was surprisingly peaceful.
Mostly, yes. The East Bloc countries broke away relatively easily, but conflicts like Chechnya show the lingering issues. And while some might feel Cold War nostalgia for stability,
You shouldn't forget the downside.
absolutely not. Mutually assured destruction and the profound lack of freedom weren't exactly good old days.
That lack of freedom, that control. It makes me think about the Nazi Empire. Could an empire built on such extreme exclusion ever last?
The source suggests, and history proved, no. Their vision of a greater Europe was explicitly about excluding undesirables, denying basic rights, denying peace itself to huge groups. Kennan saw it early on, its implicit lack of universality, its foundation on racial superiority, doomed it. Lasting empires, even brutal ones, usually have to offer some kind of inclusive peace eventually. The Nazis never intended that.
A dead end, essentially. Which brings us to the U.S. The idea of an American empire, or imperium, is common now, but it started as anti-imperial, right?
Very much so. Founded rejecting European empires. But history gets reinterpreted. Some historians see early U.S. expansion as imperial. More recently, figures like Robert Kagan or Neil Ferguson argue the U.S. is or was obliged to lead to take on imperial responsibilities, like it or not.
The leader of the free world idea.
Right, and as we mentioned, the visual language eagles, domes consciously echoes Rome. World War I was a turning point moving beyond just North America. Wilson's New World Order, then FDR's realistic Wilsonianism planning the post-WWII system, the Marshall Plan, NATO, global military bases.
Creating a U.S.-led system.
Exactly. A system spreading lightly regulated capitalism, linked often loosely with human rights. An empire of capitalist democracy, as some call it.
So we've seen rise, rule, now back to decline. The source emphasizes, this seems inevitable. Why? What causes empires to fall apart? We hear about imperial overreach.
Yeah, the declinist literature really took off, especially regarding the U.S. after Vietnam, citing things like financial strains similar to Britain earlier. Paul Kennedy's work on imperial overreach was huge.
But not everyone agreed the U.S. was declining.
Oh, no, there are strong counter-arguments. America was bound to lead because of its innovation, military tech, cultural influence, soft power again. But those parallels to Rome's fall are hard to ignore. Rome had the best minds, the best army, the dominant culture, and still got sacked by barbaric nobodies, as Gibbon put it.
A cautionary tale.
Definitely. The source even floats the idea of an American Byzantium if the U.S. pulls back too much globally. As for why decline happens, Deepak Lal suggests it's often fiscal empires tax themselves into crisis, though that's debated for Rome and the USSR.
What about Adam Smith's idea?
Ah, yes. Smith argued relying too heavily on commerce and manufacturers' finance basically is risky. Agricultural wealth is more stable. Rome depended on slave labor, Britain on trade and finance, the U.S. maybe on conspicuous consumption.
Interesting. Makes you wonder about China today with its economic model.
It certainly offers a lens for thinking about it.
So, wrapping this up, what does it all mean? Is empire good or bad? The source rightly points out that how we view history changes with the times. After 1991, some started praising empire again as an organizing principle.
A stark contrast to post-colonial critiques focusing on the damage done.
Right. And it leads to this really tough question. If nationalism and self-determination led to so much conflict and bloodshed in the post-colonial era, as some like Robert Lansing warned way back, could empire actually be a better way to organize politically than the nation-state?
That's a provocative thought. Empires used to claim legitimacy from God, the mandate of heaven, but Nietzsche's death of God took that away in the West. Nationalism seemed to win, dismantling empires, but then new groupings emerged, like the EU, arguably an empire in all but name, or the post-Soviet CIS.
It seems we keep returning to larger political structures. The source ends by suggesting a future of regional imperial players managing global capitalism together. So thinking about that, and Brzezinski's point that old-style colonialism is self-defeating now, what even is imperialism today? How will future powers balance their own interests with defending democracy or human rights globally? Lots to think about there. That was a really fantastic deep dive. We went from ancient Greece right up to today's global order and the enduring questions about empire.
It really shows how understanding these historical patterns, these complex forces of empire, is still so crucial for making sense of the world we live in right now.
Absolutely. We hope this discussion has given you a richer, more nuanced perspective on a concept that, well, clearly isn't going away. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep demanding the deep dive.